The boutique stood like a palace on Fifth Avenue, its entrance framed by polished brass doors and tall windows that gleamed under the late afternoon sun. Inside, the air was chilled and perfumed with the faint scent of leather and lilies. Crystal chandeliers rained light down onto glossy marble floors, while velvet-lined glass cases displayed diamond necklaces, sapphire rings, and gold watches as if they were untouchable relics. Every surface radiated wealth, exclusivity, and an unspoken warning. Only certain people belong here. Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside. He was tall, with an assured posture, and wore a charcoal coat over a simple navy sweater and dark jeans. His attire was tailored and immaculate, yet not ostentatious. To him, wealth didn't need to be broadcast in logos or loud statements. He walked with quiet confidence, his eyes sweeping across the displays, taking in the craftsmanship, the sparkle, the artistry behind the pieces. For Marcus, jewelry wasn't about status. It was about history, symbolism, and the stories these objects would carry when passed down through generations. The chime of the boutique's door barely had time to fade before the store's manager noticed him. The man was in his 40s, lean and crisp in a tailored gray suit, his hair slicked back like polished steel. He was standing with two sales associates, their attention fixed on a white couple browsing near the front. The couple, dressed in winter whites, were being shown tray after tray of glittering bracelets, every request answered with a smile. When Marcus began walking toward a display case at the center of the store, the manager's gaze followed him, tightening almost imperceptibly. His eyes narrowed, his jaw shifted, and he leaned slightly toward one of the associates to mutter something under his breath. The associate's eyes flickered to Marcus, then quickly back down as if embarrassed to look too long. Marcus reached the central case, where an exquisite diamond watch lay on velvet, a piece that combined bold design with elegance. He paused, studying its facets under the soft glow of the overhead lights. The manager moved toward him with the slow precision of someone reluctantly fulfilling an obligation. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager said, his tone polite but laced with frost. "Can I, help you?" The words weren't offered with genuine warmth, but with the rehearsed courtesy reserved for someone he already believed wouldn't be buying. Marcus noticed the hesitation, the strained smile that didn't touch the manager's eyes. He had seen it before in boardrooms, restaurants, airports. A look that said, "You don't belong here." Marcus met the manager's gaze calmly, giving nothing away. "Yes," he replied in his deep, even voice. "I'd like to take a closer look at this watch." The manager's lips pressed into a thin line, the faintest trace of condescension flickering across his face. He hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He glanced quickly over his shoulder at the couple still being doted upon, as though Marcus's presence was some kind of inconvenience, a disruption to the true business of the store. In that small exchange, the narrowed eyes, the shift of tone, the faintly mocking tilt of the manager's smile, the air in the boutique changed. Some customers noticed. A young woman across the room glanced at Marcus, then at the manager, her brows knitting as though she had picked up on the imbalance. Another shopper paused mid-sentence, the awkwardness settling like static in the space. Marcus remained steady, his face calm, his voice even, but inside he felt the familiar sting of contempt. He didn't raise his voice or flinch. Instead, he simply stood straighter, allowing the silence to stretch. The diamonds sparkled in the case before him, glittering with all their brilliance, while the air thickened with tension, unspoken prejudice, pressing invisibly into the polished, perfumed air. And so, what had begun as a quiet visit to admire a piece of craftsmanship had turned, in an instant, into something else entirely. A stage where disdain had been carelessly cast, and where the curtain on a greater drama was about to rise. The manager's hesitation stretched into a silence that seemed louder than the soft, classical music floating through the boutique. Then, with a forced smile, he reached for the case keys and unlocked it with exaggerated slowness, as if the act itself was a burden. He carefully lifted the velvet tray holding the diamond watch and, instead of presenting it to Marcus directly, placed it on the counter between them. The gesture was subtle but clear, a reminder of distance, a barrier disguised as etiquette. Marcus leaned forward, admiring the artistry. The watch's face glimmered under the lights, every cut of diamond catching and refracting light like frozen fire. It was bold but elegant, the sort of piece designed to be noticed. He looked up at the manager. "How much is this one?" Marcus asked evenly. The manager's smirk was faint, but it lingered at the corner of his mouth. "That particular watch is quite exclusive," he said, stressing the last word as though it were meant to exclude Marcus himself. "It's priced well above what most people would expect." He paused, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you want to know the cost?" The words landed like a slap. A couple nearby, the same white couple who had been ushered around with warm smiles moments before, froze in place. The woman glanced at Marcus with a flicker of embarrassment, while her partner shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study a tray of earrings, but unable to ignore the sharpness of the remark. Marcus didn't blink. He met the manager's eyes and nodded. "Yes, I'm asking." The manager's tone grew sharper, though the smile remained stiff and brittle. "Well, this is a piece worth several $100,000. Perhaps," he said, lowering his voice, as though offering advice, "you'd prefer to see something more approachable? We have a selection of sterling silver bands. Very tasteful, very affordable. I can show you those instead." A nervous laugh trickled from the sales associate nearby, who quickly looked down at the counter, ashamed of the reflex. Across the room, a few other shoppers caught on to the exchange. Their faces shifted from casual interest in jewelry to curiosity, even discomfort, as they sensed the imbalance of power being exercised so openly. Marcus's jaw tightened, though his expression remained calm. He had lived through this dance before. The polite insult, the subtle suggestion that his presence was an error. Still, the sting of it never dulled. He glanced once more at the diamond watch, not because he doubted his ability to own it, but because he understood exactly what it symbolized in this moment. A mirror reflecting prejudice back at the one holding it. The white couple that had been doted upon only minutes earlier suddenly looked uneasy with their privileged role in the scene. The woman's voice was hushed but urgent as she whispered to her companion, "Did you hear how he said that? That's not right." Her partner nodded, but their discomfort kept them frozen in place. The manager, however, remained oblivious to how the room had shifted. He mistook Marcus's silence for hesitation, his calm for defeat. Straightening his suit jacket, he allowed himself a thin, self-satisfied smile, as though he had successfully redirected someone he deemed unworthy. Marcus looked around the boutique, his gaze sweeping over the opulence, the shelves of jewels sparkling like trapped stars, the faces of onlookers caught between curiosity and dismay. Then, his eyes returned to the manager. "No," Marcus said finally, his voice low but clear. "I came to see this one, and I will." The room seemed to still at the firmness in his tone. The chandeliers continued to glitter, the music continued to play, but in that moment, the stage was set, and every person inside the boutique understood they were no longer simply shoppers. They were witnesses to something far larger than the purchase of a watch. The faint hum of the boutique's air conditioning seemed to grow louder as the tension thickened. Marcus's steady gaze unsettled the manager, who adjusted his tie and forced another brittle smile. His lips curved, but his eyes betrayed the irritation of a man whose authority was being quietly challenged. "I understand, sir," the manager said slowly, emphasizing sir with a false civility that carried the sting of mockery. "But you must also understand, this watch is delicate. We don't simply hand it to anyone who walks in off the street. Handling it requires a certain level of, shall we say, assurance?" The words hung in the air like smoke. The couple nearby exchanged quick glances. The woman pressed her lips together, visibly disturbed, while her partner stared down at the earrings in his hands as if they could shield him from complicity. A middle-aged man in a navy overcoat, standing near another display case, frowned openly at the manager's words. Marcus didn't move. His calm presence seemed to unnerve the manager even further. "I'm not anyone," Marcus replied, his voice low, even, but carrying across the boutique with the weight of unshakable certainty. The manager gave a short, sharp laugh, an attempt at lightness that revealed itself as ridicule. Of course," he said dismissively. waving a manicured hand. "But perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at items within a more modest range. We pride ourselves on having something for everyone." He glanced toward the section of silver bands and basic gold chains, his gesture subtle but unmistakable. A hush fell over the boutique. The sales associate beside him shifted uncomfortably, her cheeks flushed pink, as though she wanted to speak but knew better than to intervene. Another shopper, an older woman with a cane, muttered under her breath, though no one caught the words. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, each second pressing down harder than the last. His eyes were steady, unflinching, and for the first time the manager felt a flicker of unease under the calm intensity of his gaze. Yet pride kept him rigid, locked into his role, unwilling to bend. "I told you," Marcus said at last, enunciating each word with quiet precision. "I came here to see this watch, and I will not be directed elsewhere." The manager's smile faltered. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice though it carried easily in the stillness of the boutique. "Let's not make this difficult," he said. "I have other customers to attend to." His tone hardened, stripped now of the mask of politeness. "If you're not here to make a purchase, I suggest you admire from a distance and leave it at that." The words landed with a sharpness that cut through the air, and the boutique seemed to collectively inhale. The young sales associate turned away, pretending to rearrange a tray of earrings to avoid the shame of being complicit. The couple stood frozen, no longer pretending to browse, their discomfort plain on their faces. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained controlled, almost regal in its composure. Inside, however, a storm was forming, not of rage, but of resolve. He recognized the moment for what it was. Not simply a personal insult, but a performance of prejudice, executed boldly in public, cloaked in the thin veil of exclusivity. He let the silence hang, the weight of the insult echoing in the room. The manager, emboldened by what he perceived as submission, straightened his jacket and prepared to move away, his hand already reaching for the tray to lock it back in the case. But Marcus's hand moved first, not to snatch or grasp, but to rest lightly on the counter, steady, deliberate, commanding. His voice followed, measured and resonant. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness." The entire boutique froze. The chandeliers glittered above like 1,000 unblinking eyes. The music, once unnoticed, now felt painfully loud. Every customer, every associate, every observer was caught in the orbit of this confrontation, their breaths held, waiting for what would come next. In that suspended moment, the story was no longer about a watch, nor even about a store. It was about dignity challenged, prejudice laid bare, and a man who refused to yield an inch of his ground. The manager's hand hovered above the velvet tray, his fingers curling possessively around the edge, as though he could shield the diamonds from Marcus by sheer force of will. His expression, once painted with condescending charm, now betrayed irritation and a flicker of defensiveness. But Marcus did not retreat. His steady presence at the counter, the calm strength in his posture, unsettled the rhythm of the boutique in ways the manager hadn't anticipated. "Sir," the manager began again, his voice clipped and rehearsed, "this is an establishment of refinement. Our pieces are curated for a clientele that understands their value." Marcus cut across him, his tone even but sharper than any blade. "And what makes you so sure I don't?" The question was direct, and for the first time, the manager had no immediate response. His lips parted as if to form a retort, but no words came. The pause was heavy, broken only by the soft tick of an ornate clock displayed near the entrance. The silence emboldened Marcus. He straightened his shoulders, his presence filling the boutique, not with volume, but with authority. He reached into his pocket with measured precision, drawing out a sleek black leather wallet. When he placed it on the counter, its subtle elegance contrasted sharply with the gaudy opulence of the jewels around them. From within, he pulled out a platinum credit card, its surface catching the chandelier light in a way that was impossible to miss. The air in the room shifted instantly. The sales associate's eyes widened as she caught the gleam of the card, her breath catching in her throat. The couple, who had been frozen in silent discomfort, exchanged looks of dawning realization. Even the man in the navy overcoat lifted his eyebrows, curiosity sparking across his face. Marcus let the card rest on the velvet counter between himself and the manager. His hand remained lightly on top of it, not flaunting, but asserting. "You judged me the moment I walked in," he said, his voice calm yet unyielding. "You saw my skin and decided I didn't belong here, that I couldn't possibly understand the worth of what you sell." The words fell like stones in water, sending ripples through every corner of the boutique. The manager's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he fought to maintain composure. He attempted to laugh, but the sound was hollow, brittle, easily broken. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, his voice rising an octave. "You're twisting my words. I was merely suggesting—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but controlled, as unshakable as the ground beneath their feet. "You weren't suggesting. You were dismissing. And you weren't subtle about it." He leaned slightly closer, his eyes locked with the manager's, his voice dropping into a resonance that carried the weight of lived experience. "This isn't the first time I've been told I don't belong, but every time I've proven otherwise." The young sales associate lowered her eyes, unable to meet Marcus's gaze, her shame almost palpable. The older woman with the cane nodded faintly to herself, as though Marcus's words had echoed something long buried in her memory. The couple stood straighter, their unease giving way to indignation on his behalf. Marcus tapped the credit card once against the velvet tray. "So here's what we're going to do. You're going to stop talking. You're going to let me see the watch I asked for. And when I decide what I want to do with it, you'll ring it up. Nothing more, nothing less." The authority in his tone was undeniable. It wasn't the voice of a man requesting permission. It was the voice of a man issuing instruction, one accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The manager hesitated, his pride waging war with the sudden awareness that the ground beneath him was slipping. His rehearsed superiority faltered under Marcus's unshakable calm. Around them, the boutique's quiet hum seemed to hold its breath, the jewelry glittering like silent witnesses to the shifting balance of power. For the first time since Marcus had walked through the glass doors, the manager felt the truth settle on him like an unwelcome weight. The man standing before him was not someone to be dismissed. He was someone who carried himself with the dignity of experience, the assurance of means, and the authority of a presence that no prejudice could diminish. And in that moment, the manager realized he had miscalculated, not just in judgment, but in the very essence of who Marcus was. The boutique had gone so still that the faint chime of the doorbell outside echoed louder than it should have. Yet no one turned toward the entrance. All eyes remained fixed on Marcus and the platinum card resting on the velvet tray, like a challenge the manager could not ignore. The sales associate's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted a tray of earrings, though her eyes kept darting back to the confrontation. The couple in the corner barely moved, their shopping forgotten. Even the man in the navy overcoat, who had seemed disinterested at first, leaned forward with sharpened attention. The manager's face had flushed pink, a blotchy mix of embarrassment and anger. His polished confidence, so flawless when he first dismissed Marcus, was cracking like cheap porcelain. He cleared his throat, tugging at his collar, and with forced reluctance pulled the tray closer. He unlocked the glass case, the metallic click of the key sounding louder than ever in the suffocating silence, and finally brought out the diamond-encrusted watch. He placed it on the counter with exaggerated care, as though the diamonds might scatter if touched improperly. His movements were stiff, every gesture mechanical, lacking the fluidity of genuine service. "Here it is," he muttered, trying to mask his discomfort under the pretense of professionalism. Marcus studied the watch, but did not immediately touch it. Instead, he looked back at the manager with a steady, unblinking gaze. "Beautiful craftsmanship," he said calmly. "But let me tell you something." He allowed a pause, his voice carrying just enough to fill the boutique. "A watch like this is meant to represent time, legacy, endurance. Yet here, in this place, it's being used to measure something else entirely. Assumptions, prejudice, limits." The words hit their mark. The couple exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening with agreement. The young sales associate bit her lip, her face flushed, as though Marcus's words echoed the guilt she had silently carried while watching the scene unfold. Marcus lifted the watch gently, holding it in his palm. The diamonds shimmered under the chandelier light, reflecting off his skin like flecks of fire. His voice deepened, firm and resonant. I came here planning to buy one piece, but after the way I've been treated, after being told with such arrogance that I don't belong, I've decided on something different. The manager's eyes narrowed, a flicker of nervousness betraying him. Different? How? He asked, his voice wavering despite his attempt at control. Marcus let the watch rest against the counter again, but kept his hand over it like a declaration of ownership. His words fell into the quiet boutique with unshakable authority. I'll take the entire collection, every watch, every necklace, every ring, every piece in this room. The air seemed to collapse in on itself. A stunned silence followed, so profound that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. The couple gasped audibly. The man in the overcoat let out a low whistle, and the sales associate froze in disbelief. The manager blinked, certain he had misheard. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish caught gasping for water. The entire collection? He repeated, his voice strangled between incredulity and fear. Yes, Marcus replied, his tone as calm and deliberate as if he were ordering coffee. Every single piece you thought I wasn't good enough to see. He slid the platinum card closer across the velvet, the metallic sheen glinting under the lights. And here's the part that should really concern you. I'm not buying it for myself. I'm donating it all. To charity auctions, to scholarships, to hospitals raising money for children who need care. His gaze never wavered, his voice steady and unwavering. What you treated as a symbol of exclusion, I will turn into a symbol of giving. The revelation rippled through the room like a shockwave. The young sales associate covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes watering at the sheer magnitude of his statement. The couple looked at him with admiration, the discomfort on their faces replaced by awe. Even the older woman with the cane, who had been quietly watching from near the door, leaned forward and whispered, "Bless you, son," with a trembling voice. The manager, however, looked pale, his polished mask now completely shattered. His arrogance had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving only raw exposure. But that's impossible, he stammered, his voice cracking. You can't be serious. Marcus leaned closer, his eyes narrowing but his voice calm. Do I look like a man who isn't serious? The question struck like a hammer. The silence that followed was heavier than before, but now it was charged, not with humiliation, but with a sense of reckoning. Everyone in the boutique knew what had just happened. The dynamic had shifted. The man who had been dismissed and belittled now stood in full command, not only of the moment, but of the narrative itself. And the manager, trembling under the weight of his own misjudgment, realized with dawning horror that this was no ordinary customer. The manager's hands trembled as he fumbled with the tray, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an iron shackle. The arrogance that had once coated his voice had been stripped away entirely, leaving him exposed in front of his staff, his customers, and most damningly, Marcus himself. The boutique, once a sanctuary of exclusivity, felt claustrophobic, the glitter of diamonds and gold now casting an accusatory glare. Marcus did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, deliberate words carried the authority of someone who had nothing to prove. You said I didn't belong. You implied I wasn't worthy to hold even a single watch. And now here you are, standing before me, forced to acknowledge that everything in this room, everything you use to measure status and worth, can be transformed into something greater than profit or pride. It will serve a purpose you couldn't begin to imagine. The sales associate who had stayed silent earlier now stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mix of guilt and awe. Sir, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly, would you like me to prepare the paperwork for the entire collection? She glanced nervously at the manager, then back at Marcus, silently pleading for permission to help. Marcus nodded once, his expression kind but firm. Yes, thank you. The manager turned sharply toward her, his face blotchy and damp with sweat. No, wait, he snapped, his voice uneven, betraying his unraveling. This, this isn't how things are done. An entire collection? It's absurd. He stopped himself, the word he hanging in the air with a venomous edge, one that made the couple in the corner exchange disgusted looks. The man in the navy overcoat stepped forward now, his voice strong and resonant. I think you've said enough, he cut in sharply, looking directly at the manager. We've all heard enough. The gentleman has made his intentions clear. If you can't handle the transaction with dignity, then step aside and let someone else do the work. His words were followed by murmurs of agreement from the others in the boutique, each one a quiet act of solidarity against the prejudice that had just been laid bare. The manager faltered, his jaw tightening, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He looked around, realizing the room was no longer on his side. His authority, once absolute within the glass walls of this boutique, had crumbled under the weight of his own bias. The shame of being exposed in front of customers gnawed at him, twisting his stomach with dread. Marcus, still calm, addressed him directly. Do you understand what has happened here today? You tried to reduce me to an assumption. You measured me by the color of my skin, by the prejudice in your heart, and not once did you consider who I might actually be. Now you're left standing here, powerless, because the very system of judgment you cling to has betrayed you. The manager's lips quivered, but no words came. His silence spoke louder than any defense could have. He was a man cornered, not by Marcus, but by his own choices. Meanwhile, the sales associate hurried to gather folders and documents, her fingers trembling as she laid them neatly on the counter. She whispered apologies Marcus didn't demand, but which spilled out of her in a rush of remorse. The older woman with the cane shuffled closer and placed a gentle hand over Marcus's arm. The good you're about to do, she said softly, her eyes glistening, will shine brighter than all these diamonds combined. Marcus bowed his head respectfully at her words, then returned his gaze to the manager. You thought you had power over me, he said. But real power isn't in denying someone dignity. It's in lifting others up. That's why every single piece in here will go toward helping those who need it most. Children, families, communities that society has overlooked. Just as you tried to overlook me. The weight of his words pressed down on the manager, who now stood motionless, his pride collapsing into a hollow shell. He knew there was no recovery, no mask he could wear to erase what had been revealed in the boutique that day. The humiliation was complete, not because Marcus had shouted or demanded vengeance, but because he had chosen grace and purpose over pettiness. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Customers who had come merely to browse now looked on as witnesses to a moment of transformation. The boutique no longer felt like a shrine to wealth, but like a stage where truth had been spoken and justice quietly rendered. The paperwork began to take shape under the associate's careful hands, and the realization settled like a stone in the manager's chest. The very collection he had tried to guard as untouchable, as exclusive, was about to leave his store, not in the possession of the elite he imagined, but in service of a cause far greater than himself. Marcus stood tall, calm and resolute, as the boutique itself seemed to bend around him, not as a man denied, but as a man whose dignity had triumphed over arrogance. The staff worked quickly, the murmurs of admiration from the customers growing with each passing moment, while the manager remained frozen, swallowed by his own disgrace. And in that quiet collapse of prejudice, the true shift of power was complete. The boutique was hushed, though no one had asked for silence. It was the sort of quiet that followed awe, heavy and reverent, where every tick of the ornate wall clock seemed amplified. The paperwork was nearly finished, a thick stack of documents lined neatly on the counter. Each signature Marcus added transforming the jewels from trophies of vanity into instruments of change. The sales associate's pen trembled in her hand as she handed him each page, but her face shone with a mixture of relief and admiration, as though she were proud to be even a small part of this moment. Across the room, customers lingered with wide eyes, watching history in miniature unfold before them. They had walked in expecting the usual pageantry of wealth, a place where only the privileged browsed and purchased. But now, they found themselves witnesses to a reversal so profound, It would be whispered long after the boutique's lights dimmed for the night. Marcus signed the final page and set the pen down with deliberate calm. He didn't rush, didn't gloat, didn't so much as glance at the stunned manager. His every movement carried the grace of someone who understood that victory was not in humiliating another, but in rising above them. When the last document was stamped and slid across the counter, Marcus leaned back slightly, surveying the glittering trays that were now his. "I want them delivered to the foundation by the end of the week," he said firmly, his voice carrying a clarity that rang like crystal through the boutique. "Every piece will be auctioned, and every dollar will go toward education programs and shelters for children in need." The words landed like thunder. A murmur rippled through the boutique, soft gasps and sighs blending with whispers of admiration. The older woman with the cane dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The man in the navy overcoat exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at his lips as he muttered, "Incredible. Absolutely incredible." Even the younger couple, who had been showered with courtesy earlier, nodded in approval, visibly moved by the grace of Marcus's decision. The manager, meanwhile, looked shattered. His complexion was pale, his posture sagged, and his hands twitched at his sides. He had been stripped of the invisible armor he once wore, status, arrogance, entitlement, and stood revealed for what he was, a man undone by his own prejudice. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to salvage even a shred of dignity, but the words died before they could form. Marcus finally turned his eyes to him, steady and unwavering. "You tried to deny me respect," he said softly, though the quietness of his tone made it all the more piercing. "You measured me by ignorance. But respect isn't yours to give or take. It's something we all owe one another, simply as human beings. Today, you chose arrogance. I chose purpose." The manager's throat bobbed, but he said nothing. His silence was confession enough. Marcus gathered his coat, adjusted it smoothly across his shoulders, and picked up his leather briefcase. He didn't need to carry the jewels. The associate promised their delivery would be handled personally with the utmost care. Before leaving, Marcus offered a small nod of gratitude to the customers who had stood in solidarity, then paused at the door. For a brief moment, he looked back at the boutique, the chandeliers blazing like frozen stars, the counters heavy with treasures, the air still charged with what had transpired. His gaze lingered not on the diamonds or the gold, but on the faces, the wide-eyed awe of the customers, the quiet remorse of the staff, and the hollow despair etched into the manager's features. Then, Marcus stepped out into the cool night air, where the city hummed with life beyond the boutique's gilded walls. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the moment into memory. He walked down the street with steady strides, not as a man flaunting wealth, but as one carrying a mission. Within hours, the story would spread. A customer filmed parts of the exchange on her phone, her shaky hands capturing the moment Marcus declared the collection's purpose. The video would ripple across social media, sparking conversations about dignity, prejudice, and the power of using wealth for good. News outlets would seize it, headlines framing Marcus not as a man scorned, but as a man who transformed an insult into an act of extraordinary generosity. By the following week, when the jewels were auctioned for staggering sums, children in underserved neighborhoods would benefit from new classrooms, new resources, and the hope that opportunity could be theirs. The diamonds that once symbolized exclusivity and arrogance would now glitter as symbols of possibility and change. And in the quiet of his boutique, the manager would relive that night endlessly, tormented not by Marcus's wealth, but by the memory of how his own prejudice had reduced him to a spectator in his own downfall. Marcus, however, would not dwell on the insult. His heart would rest in the knowledge that he had done something greater than buy jewels. He had turned arrogance into a lesson, cruelty into generosity, and prejudice into a story of triumph. And in doing so, he left behind more than just a stunned jeweler. He left behind a legacy of dignity that gleamed brighter than any diamond.